So that's good. I like sort of putting a contents thing on things like this that I do, give you some sense of where we're going. I'm going to have some introductory remarks. Most of what we talk about today will fall into the second category, and you'll see kind of the reason for that in a moment. I will try to reach some sort of a cogent conclusion, and then you can determine whether any of this makes any sense to you as we have some conversation. So this presentation is an expanded version of a forthcoming article in Adventist Today, the summer issue, July to September, under the title, "The Problem with the Ten Commandments in Public Schools." It's something in dialogue with Lauren. He asked me to write. I submitted a version of it. It was something that he wanted to have condensed a little bit. So I did that. If I were to present that today, I'd be done here pretty quickly, and maybe that would be ideal. But I have thought about this beyond what I put into the piece for A Today, because I have to make a presentation on this in about a month from now. And for some strange reason, I like to get started on these assignments early. And so I actually put this whole thing together, except for final touches, sometime earlier this week. So when Lauren called me, mercifully, I didn't have to do a lot of work on this because I had most of it in mind and most of it actually drafted by then. But there's always some need for making a piece appropriate for a given group, and so forth. So here we go. Earlier this year, the state of Louisiana, as most of you know, legislated that all of its public school classrooms, from kindergarten through university, must display the Ten Commandments, often referred to as the Decalogue, coming from a Greek word that means simply 10 words. Aside from the legitimate U.S. constitutional concerns, which I won't deal with here, but which are real and significant, concerns about the independence of religion from government and the obvious Judeo-Christian bias it engenders, this legislation, in my mind, begs several important questions that relate to the content of the Decalogue, the answers to which should inform the decision of whether to require the display of the Ten Commandments in American public classrooms. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of our time now, which is a set of content questions that relate to the Decalogue. The first question is, what Old Testament text or version of the Decalogue should be displayed? Now, that might seem an obvious question. Everybody knows the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments found in Exodus 20, verses 2 to 17. This is well known. It's the most well-known and probably beloved of these Decalogue materials, and probably one of the most well-known passages in Scripture. Some people realize that there's, in the book of Deuteronomy, a version of the Ten Commandments as well. In fact, as you may know, the word Deuteronomy comes from two Greek words, one, nomi, at the end, which comes from the Greek word for law, and deutero at the beginning, which is a word that relates to second, or the number two. So the name Deuteronomy, even itself, conveys the notion of the second law, or the repeated law. And in chapter 5, verses 6 to 21, we find the Ten Commandments in the same order, with a lot of the same language, but with some wording and concept differences. For example, the rationale for the fourth command in Deuteronomy's version is God's salvation of Israel from Egyptian slavery, rather than God's creation of the world in 6 days and resting on the seventh, as we find in Exodus. And as you probably know much better than the Deuteronomy piece. For scholars of the Hebrew Bible, and I think theologians both within and outside of Adventism, this makes for a very interesting dichotomy, because while Exodus 20, conveying the fourth commandment, justifies it on the basis of God's creative activity, Deuteronomy 5, in its rendition of the Sabbath commandment, justifies the command based on God's salvific activity, his salvation activity. He's saving of Israel from slavery. This makes for a very interesting dichotomy when one writes the theology of this material, because not only an event seen to be in the history of a group of people, but in the distant past, the creation of the world, and the sixness and the seventh and so forth, but a saving activity that was in the experience of everybody who, in the text at least, is said to have received this on the way to the land that they were promised. What is probably least known among these various versions of the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments is a set of injunctions found in Exodus 34, verses 11 to 26. It doesn't really read like the more well-known versions of the Decalogue in Exodus and Deuteronomy that we've noted. This is much more of a cultic or ritualistic version that talks about the necessity for performing various ritualistic acts and so forth. So the first question then is, which of these should be displayed? That's certainly not found in the legislation. Secondly, if we assume that the popular version from Exodus 20 is to be displayed, what textual or manuscript tradition would be used? Now, this is a question that scholars of the Hebrew Bible, biblical scholars more generally, might be led to ask, more so than regular readers of the text. But somebody has to ask this, because there are various textual traditions that lie behind the Decalogue. The one that is used by most translators, or those who collect the readings in Hebrew and present them as a Hebrew Bible, the one that is most commonly used is what we call the Masoretic text, which while it was in the process of formation around the time of Jesus, it didn't come into standardization for quite a number of centuries after that. This is typically abbreviated the MT, the Masoretic text. Most, as I mentioned, most modern translations depend on this, but there are several other options that differ to one degree or another from the Masoretic text. For example, the Samaritan Pentateuch, Pentateuch being the term for the first five books of the Hebrew Bible, the Samaritan Pentateuch, which predates the Masoretic text by probably a millennium. It was in vogue to some extent within Palestine, probably 125, 30 years prior to the time of Jesus. Now, this reads a lot like the Masoretic text, except commands numbers 1 and 2 are combined, and that leaves only 9. So they added a 10th one, which deals after the one in the Masoretic text, which is number 10, dealing with coveting. This is added on as a command to set up stones in certain configurations to be used for cultic purposes, probably as an altar for the offering of sacrifices. And then we have the Septuagint, usually abbreviated LXX, standing for the Latin number 70. I won't go into the reason why that is the case, but it's an interesting and somewhat funny story. But anyway, the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew, and it predated the Masoretic text, at least by the amount that the Samaritan Pentateuch did. Possibly starting in Egypt among Greek-speaking Jews living there, needing to have a Bible they could read, they began translating the Old Testament text in the 3rd century BC. Interesting today, this is a text of the Bible and thereby of the Pentateuch as well, that is preferred by Eastern Orthodox Christians even today. Now, it reads pretty much the same as the Masoretic text, except that the order of some of the commands has been shifted. Instead of 6, 7, and 8 in Exodus 20, it's 7, 8, and 6. Those numbers refer to the numbers of the commands in the Ten Commandments. Deuteronomy 5 is also in a different order, not only from the Hebrew, but different from Exodus 20, where the order is commands 7, 6, and 8. So this is maybe not a big deal in the minds of a lot of people, certainly the legislators who created this, but even lay people who are necessarily looking at the issue. But it is something that if a person is acquainted with the textual tradition behind the various parts of the Hebrew Bible, this kind of question comes into play. What translation into English of the Ten Commandments should be displayed? This is my question number 3. Well, presumably one would think of the King James, KJV, of the text that we noted above, particularly, let's say, the text in Exodus, which most people know. However, to my knowledge, no one today speaks the Elizabethan language, the Elizabethan English of the King James Version. And I think of children at all levels. I would certainly find such language confusing, if not completely incomprehensible. And I was testing this on my granddaughter just yesterday, after I learned I was going to do this. She's visiting here right now, and she teaches the 1st grade in a public school. I said, would the King James Version of the Ten Commandments be comprehensible to your students? She said, of course not. So, if not the King James Version, what translation should be used? Well, there are lots of options. Various religious and faith traditions within local communities, where these decisions will have to be made, would no doubt have their own preferences. For example, Jews, whether Hebrew speaking or otherwise, would probably prefer something like the new Jewish Publication Society bilingual version, typically referred to as the NJV, the new Jewish version. Roman Catholics sometimes like to present aspects of the Ten Commandments in slightly different ways. They might want to use a very highly regarded Catholic version, the New American Bible, NAB. Evangelical Protestants may prefer the New International Version, copyrighted by Zondervan and published by them. More progressive Protestants would likely choose something like the New Revised Standard Version. And you'll see me quoting from that occasionally in this presentation. And then we come to Jehovah's Witnesses. They would certainly demand the New World Translation, which is their own Bible. And then I got to thinking about Mormons. I decided to look into the Book of Mormon to see if it had the Ten Commandments. And I found them there in Mosiah 12 and 13. So I'm thinking Latter-day Saints may certainly want the version in the Book of Mormon. But of course, many children come from faith traditions outside of Judaism and Christianity, or from non-religious backgrounds. None of these translations of the Decalogue would have any unique meaning for them. Although these English translations are generally similar, they are not identical and sometimes convey different meanings. For example, The sixth commandment, Exodus 20, verse 13, reads, "You shall not kill." And we find this in the King James Version and the New American Bible, and in the Latter-day Saints version of this in the Book of Mormon. The reading is the commonly understood, "You shall not kill." But that's not actually what the Hebrew says. There's a particular word used there, which is better understood, "You shall not commit murder," or "You shall not murder." Well, that makes more sense in the Mosaic laws because there's so many of these laws. If you break them, the community has the right to execute you, if not the responsibility. And so that would be a violation of the sixth commandment if the sixth commandment simply meant, "You shall not kill." But the sixth commandment is more properly translated by the New Jewish Version, the New International Version, New NRSV, and the Jehovah's Witness Version as, "You shall not murder." I found that the LDS version of the fourth commandment differs from Exodus 20, verse 11, by not including the statement concerning God. After it says God created the world and the heavens and the earth and so forth in 6 days, quote, "and rested the seventh day." That expression, that little clause, "and rested the seventh day," is not found for whatever reason in the LDS version. The LDS version also brings the whole thing up to date for the most part, not completely, but most of it is brought up to date into modern language, away from the Elizabethan language of the 17th century. So let's go to the fourth question. Are the 10 Commandments, regardless of biblical version, text, or English translation, relevant in the modern world? This is probably my most important question, and I come at it a couple of different ways in this question and some others. But there's a related question even right here, which is, who were the intended readers of the ancient Decalogue? Well, the obvious answer would be the people who heard Moses deliver it to them, or if they could understand what God was saying to them from God, or in the written form, the people in the desert on the way from Egypt to Canaan. But what actually lies behind this? Well, it's not possible from the English translations of most of the commands to answer the second question, who were the original readers, because they are simply addressed as you. And the problem with that in English, as you well know now, the word you can be you singular or you plural. And if all you see is you, you don't know what is intended unless you examine the context. Or if it's a translation of from another language, that other language, Hebrew, let's say, Greek, Aramaic, will answer that, because those three languages in particular, and many others, make a distinction between you singular and you plural. And this is why in the Elizabethan form of the English language found in the King James Bible, you have words like thou, which are used here in the text, in these texts. Thou, thy, thine. And sometimes you have you and ye. And you wonder what's going on here. Well, it's not some sort of sacred language, as people later thought and decided they had to pray that way to God, because here was a sacred language in the Bible. Bible doesn't have a sacred language. Even the King James Bible doesn't have a sacred language. Thou is simply you singular in Elizabethan English. Thy is the possessive form of that. Thou and thine and so forth. When the underlying Hebrew and Greek texts had a second person plural in mind, they used the word you and ye. So you can figure out what the Greek and Hebrew is most of the time by simply looking at the English words in the Elizabethan English of the King James Bible. If it's that sort of incomprehensible, ancient sounding thing, thou, thine, and so forth, it's not a sacred language. It's simply the Elizabethan singular of the second person, either a second person pronoun or a verb that is in the second person. Well, the Hebrew verbs give us some interesting clues here, but I don't want to overplay this, because here the verbs are found in the Decalogue. Many of them have imperative functions. That is, they're giving commands or requests. We call that imperative. Now, Hebrew doesn't have an imperative form as such like Greek does, but by context, verbs can be used in imperatives. What Hebrew, interestingly enough, has is, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the identification of gender, at least in terms of masculine and feminine, when it comes to all verbs. All verbs have gender in the second person and the third person. So you can tell whether somebody is being spoken to or spoken about who is masculine or feminine. Except, of course, they don't have a general common use, and so the masculine very frequently is used to function as the common use. So I don't want to overplay this, but it's interesting that every imperatively used verb throughout the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 are masculine verbs. But lest we make too much of this, let's look at the 10th command, which reads in the New Revised Standard Version in Exodus 20:17 and similarly in Deuteronomy 5:21, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. Okay? You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Ah, that's interesting. Or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Well, here we have this declaration, this demand, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Now, who is likely to be the recipient of that command? You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Well, technically, it could be another woman, and that might have more freer kind of representation in today's society. But then, while such was not unknown, this would have been almost unthinkable to put into a text for a community. Rather, this is much easier to understand as being addressed to a man, very likely a married man, and one who was the owner of property. All of the things mentioned here anciently were considered to be property. The house, the spouse, well, that is the wife, the male and female slaves. We have the nice rendition of this in the King James Bible from the 17th century that calls these man servant and maid servant. That doesn't sound so problematic, does it? Man servant, maid servant. The underlying Hebrew text is properly translated here in the New Revised Standard Version as male and female slaves. So you have these elements of property: real estate, wife, slaves, cattle, and livestock. So this person addressed here is male, likely married, the owner of property, including housewife, slaves, and livestock. He's enjoined from coveting or desiring any of these that his neighbor owns. Now, if we look at the 8th commandment, this echoes something similar, but much less obvious. The 8th command says, you shall not commit adultery. It has the masculine form in the verb, but we're not going to make too much out of that. What is this negative behavior that is referred to here as adultery? Well, in the ancient world, including ancient Israel, this was understood to be a crime committed by one man against another, or a married woman against her husband. So the common denominator here is the husband to whom the woman was married, or the husband of a woman against which another man committed a crime, a sexual crime. This makes sense in the ancient world, I hate to say to us here, but it's true. It makes sense in the ancient world because women were considered property. They were the property of their fathers, and the father received a bride price from another man whose son, or the son himself, would come and pay this to the father, and ownership of the woman would be transferred to the husband. The laws about these kinds of activities represented in the Hebrew Bible, especially what we call the Law of Moses, makes sense only if you view things in this way. I wrote a major piece of work in my graduate work on the role of women as understood by the wisdom of Sirach, a Jewish book written about 180 years before the time of Jesus. And it's heavily dependent on the Old Testament materials. And this idea is developed much more openly, but based on, nonetheless, of these Hebrew Bible materials. So, if what I'm saying is correct, I believe it to be so, but you'll have to decide that. The eighth commandment about adultery is part and parcel of the same kind of thing we're talking about here. It's addressed to a man because it is a man who commits adultery under these environments, or a married woman against her husband. So yes, this could go either way, but it is certainly grounded in an underlying patriarchalism. The slavery and livestock aspects of ownership are also found in the fourth commandment, where in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, you have references to slaves, male and female slaves, who are expected to be recipients of the right, participants in the right to Sabbath keeping and the obligation of Sabbath keeping in the homes of people who owned them. Those people who were visiting from elsewhere, outside of the country, the alien in your household, as the text says, also should participate in this. So we have then a whole series of things that seem to focus us to thinking about these commandments being presented to men and who are told to do or not do certain things based on common decencies and particular standards of Hebrew living. There's another cultural characteristic of the Decalogue that I'd like to just mention that pertains to the question of relevance, the first of the double question that we started this little section with. And this has to do with scientific relevance. In two places, the text anachronistically refers to the typical ancient threefold structure of the universe. Let me just read that to you. I think I have access to this here. Yeah, here we go. In the second commandment, King James Bible I'm reading now, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Heaven above, earth in the middle, water beneath. That's the typical ancient understanding of the universe. The fourth commandment has something on this as well. For in 6 days, this is verse 11, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. That is, all that's in heaven, in the earth, and in the sea. So here we have two ways of describing this threefold universe: heaven, earth, and what's beneath. What's beneath is sometimes referred to as water or the sea. This is also reflected to some extent, at least, in the material found in Deuteronomy. So, Exodus 20, verse 4, I just read that to you. Heaven above, earth beneath, water under the earth. Look at Philippians 2:10. In the New Testament, these same three dimensions are referred to as places where the name of Jesus will be exalted. The name of Jesus will be exalted above all three of these in his post-crucifixion, resurrection, exaltation. Heaven, earth, and sea, mentioned in 2011, you also find in Psalm 146, verse 6, in the first part of that verse. So these were not just things that you see popping up here in the Decalogue, but this kind of understanding of the universe, I just gave you two illustrations out of many that I could have, that in both the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the universe is considered to consist of these three things. This is not the way we understand the universe today, certainly. This is an understanding of the universe which is centered on the earth, with heaven above it and whatever is beneath it. Let's look at question 5. Do the 10 Commandments reflect universal moral principles, or are they limited to ethnic and sectarian injunctions? Well, we typically understand the Decalogue as being divided into two groups: the first 4 commands and the last 6. The last 6 are seen to reflect common universal principles that prohibit such conducts as murder and stealing. The first 4 have to do with one's obligation to God, is how we typically understand that. But there's more to it than that, I think. The first 4 injunctions focus on required behaviors within the context of Israel and its religion. How do we know that? Well, we'll look at that in just a moment a little clearer. Let me just make a few other introductory comments here to this idea. If what I'm saying is true, this would mean then that the document at hand is, in this form, is thoroughly Jewish. It became Christian, of course, as followers of Jesus of Nazareth accepted the sacred Jewish scriptures, including the Decalogue, as their own scriptures, even before they developed their own unique writings. So we see within the New Testament, which is written, of course, as part of the development of that set of Christian documents, but before they were accepted officially by the group, we see lots of references to and quotations from the Decalogue. Notably, we have Jesus and the so-called rich young ruler who have a conversation about keeping the law. And he says to Jesus, "What law are you talking about?" And Jesus is quoted in Matthew, Mark, and Luke with examples, giving examples from the Decalogue. Although there are some parallels to the biblical Decalogue in Islam, like the deity-oriented commands, but referring to their own deity, no Jewish-like elements are found in other world religions, nor would they have any meaning for non-religious persons of no faith. But let's look and see exactly what we have in these first few commandments. In fact, the first 5. The first 4 being those that relate to God primarily, but the 5th one also has a reference to this. And I'm wanting focus here on the 4 letters YHWH. Hebrew, like all Semitic languages, is based on consonants. That is, all the letters other than vowels. In fact, they didn't really have vowel letters. They had vowel markings and points that later on came to be put in the text. Hebrew is essentially a consonantal written language. And in that written language, the name of Israel's deity is considered to be Yahweh. Now, what we know for sure about this is that the 4 Hebrew consonants are YHWH, sometimes JHVH. I mean, some of these transliterations of letters are somewhat interchangeable. And the interesting thing about this is that by the time early Hebrew was just written with these consonants, later on, people became concerned about how to speak this and pronounce it in public. And reverent Jews felt it was inappropriate to actually pronounce the name of their deity. So whenever the name of their deity with the letters YHWH appeared in the text, they were expected to read instead a word which was Adonai, meaning simply Lord. So instead of speaking Yahweh's name, they'd say the word Lord. And to remind them of this, they took the vowel pointing or the vowel symbols for the word Adonai, meaning Lord, and they stuck them in and around the letters for Yahweh. And what resulted was this non-word. There was no such word in Hebrew with the letters for Yahweh and the vowels for Adonai. And Hebrews weren't confused by this because they knew the language, and they'd see this clue and they'd read the word Adonai out loud. Now, the translators of the King James Bible apparently didn't understand that. So they took the word Yahweh with a Y, a J at the beginning and a V instead of the W, and they put the vowels from Adonai with it, and they came up with Jehovah. There is no such word in the Hebrew Bible, Jehovah, because the vowels, the consonants of Jehovah are the consonants of Yahweh, and the vowels of Jehovah are the vowels of Adonai. No such combination word exists. I'm not sure how the Jehovah's Witnesses handle this situation, but they probably have some answer for it. So when you read the English Bible today and you see the word Lord in the Old Testament written in all capital letters, that's a clue from the translators, even the translators of the King James Bible, that the word behind that is the Hebrew word, what we typically pronounce as Yahweh, at least the vowels of, the consonants of YHWH. So, little wonder then, we don't focus on Judaism when we read the 10 Commandments, because it starts out, I, the Lord your God, etc. And I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Don't have any gods before me. I, the Lord your God, made the world in the heaven and earth and the sea and everything in 6 days and rested on the 7th. The Lord, L-O-R-D in capitals, is sprinkled all through the first 4 of these commandments. That makes sense only to Jews and Christians, I suppose, who accept the Jewish scriptures as part of their own. But it would not make any sense to anybody in the ancient Jewish world outside of Judaism. Notice how this works in these 5 commands. The first command says, you shall have no other gods before me. And Yahweh has just been mentioned in the previous verse. So it's Yahweh speaking. Now, I have down here that this command is henotheistic. What on earth is that? Well, you know the word monotheistic, right? Monotheism means the belief in the existence of only one God. So a monotheistic text would treat the deity that is being spoken of as the only deity there is. This text does not do that. It says, you shall have no other gods, plural, before me. What is that saying? Well, to me, it's saying Yahweh is number one. Yahweh is among all the deities there are. Yahweh is number one. That's what we call henotheism. One God who is worshipped out of a pantheon of many of them. And that frankly is, I mean, there are monotheistic type statements in the Hebrew Bible, but most of the statements that are of this nature are actually henotheistic. God of gods, Lord of lords, all those kind of language are henotheistic. No, we like to think of them as monotheistic, but they are not. The second command follows up on that, and it's exclusive. Yahweh alone is to be worshipped. I, the Lord, make no images and so forth of any other gods or deities, or me either, for that matter. Yahweh is a jealous God in the third one, does not want his name misused. Yahweh's holy day is introduced in the fourth commandment. So you have the idea of holiness that comes in. And then the fifth command says to honor your parents, your father and your mother, so that your days may go well in the land which Yahweh your God has given you. So Yahweh is featured then in the first half, as far as the numbers are concerned, the first five of the Ten Commandments. So instead of being a universal set of commands and ideas, these were directed to Israel and pertained to Yahweh, Israel's God. Well, my last question then. What does the seventh day of the fourth command, to what does it refer? Well, although as a Jewish document where the reference to the seventh day must be to Saturday, the seventh day of the week, others who revere the text understand it in different ways. On the one hand, modern Jews and some Christians like Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Baptists, and a few others understand the seventh day as Saturday, like their ancient Israelite counterparts. However, most Christians understand this as one day in the 7 weekly cycle, that is to say, Sunday or the Lord's Day. Now, please understand that I'm making this observation here about this in the context of the suitability of publicly displaying the biblical Decalogue with its Sabbath command. And I'm not here trying to establish a particular interpretation of this text as it may have been understood in the past or in the present. So I'm not trying to do exegesis on the fourth commandment here. I'm just saying, if you're going to publish the fourth commandment on the wall of a school, what are you assuming about the meaning of the fourth commandment for the people that may read it? Well, that's basically what we find, I think, when we ask a set of content questions of the biblical Decalogue. The biblical Decalogue, an ancient Jewish religious document, was addressed to males, married men who owned slaves and other forms of property. These characteristics, along with its anachronistic science, render the Ten Commandments outdated and irrelevant in the modern world. I might just stop here and say, this doesn't mean we shouldn't pay any attention to them. But like everything else in the Bible, we have to understand that which was written anciently, in an ancient language, in an ancient culture, and with ancient mores and principles. We have to be able to convert the principles of that in our own world. And the better we understand an ancient text, the more committed we will be to that process, and the more likely that we will be able to make a transition like that with some success. Furthermore, it is not clear which version or text of the Decalogue, or which one of its English translations, a state would require. Perhaps most egregious is the tacit government assumption that the display of this Judeo-Christian document would be acceptable to those outside those faith communities, including those of no faith tradition, given these uncertainties, and especially their modern irrelevance, no American political jurisdiction should require any classroom to display the biblical Ten Commandments. So the time is yours. I will stop sharing this.
Thank you, Warren. I really appreciate it. I've got a number of hands up. I'm anticipating some rather poignant discussion. And let me perhaps take my prerogative and ask you if you have a position on posting other commandments, laws, iterations in classrooms as compared to and choosing exclusively these considered 10 commandments. Is there a difference?
Let me see if I understand your question, Gerald. Are you asking if I'm arguing against the posting of the biblical Decalogue? Would I be in favor of posting some other set of things that might derive from that or be parallel to it? Is that your question?
Right, like the Code of Hammurabi or any others that you might put up there.
No, I would not. I would not use the venue of public education or any kind of education to post that. I suppose if it were a parochial school and everybody was expected to be from a particular tradition, you might post something from that. But I tend to find, in terms of even within a community, there's a wide variety of viewpoints and parental and family traditions and so forth. To try to come up with something that would be uh, satisfactory or acceptable to everybody, I think would be a problem. I mean, probably everybody would agree you shouldn't murder people, so, but, there are things maybe like that, but that can certainly be part of the overall cultural experience of living in a community that generally accepts a dictum of that sort. I don't see the necessity of it, and I think you create more problems in splitting people and segmenting them than you solve by doing that sort of thing.
So do you believe that this code would not be a splitting? I'm anticipating that it will be, and I guess the courts will have at it.
Yeah, well, the courts are going to decide it on, I suppose, on legal grounds, and so you go to the Constitution, you look at the Bill of Rights, and you talk about things like this and tradition and prior court decisions and everything else that goes on in a court. But I wouldn't expect the court, at least to rule definitively on anything that I've talked about today, because that is not typically found in jurisprudence.
Right, but I can't imagine that it won't be brought up by some of the arguments that are brought forth. It'll be
Sure,
I've got 3 hands up. Ann H., you have had your hand up for a long time. If you have a comment, I'd like you to unmute and let us know about it. If you just had your hand left up from my initial request, I'd honor that as well. Ann, are you there and have something? If not, Lauren, you're up. You're number 1.
Oh, yeah,
several others behind you.
This was fascinating, Warren. I really appreciated this. Now, I got to push you a little bit on this. One of the last things that you said we need to look at the principles behind these ideas. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, he talks about this. Lewis is very big on there being, he's sort of a Platonist, and he sees, he appears to see that all cultures in the world were based on these principles. He doesn't do the old thing of saying that they got them all from Christians, but he does say, in all cultures in the world, people had these similar principles. He calls it the Tao, I think, these universal principles. And it strikes me as I think about this, if we're going to look at the principle behind these rules, you made a very clear case that the rules themselves don't cover all of the things that we think they should cover. You know, that a woman is her husband's property probably isn't a good lesson for today, but it has within it the idea that we should not be trying to take away to take things that don't belong to us. Is that not what Louisiana and the other states are doing when they put out their edited list of 10 commandments? Their short list: don't worship any god before me, don't steal, don't kill, don't lie, don't commit adultery. Are they not boiling down that list to general universal principles that are probably found in every culture in the world in some form or another? You understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. Well, that's not what they're proposing, as far as I understand. They're proposing putting up a biblical text. So I'm raising questions about things like, well, which version of it, which translation, which this and that. And then I'm examining the other aspects of relevance and content and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, if they put something up in the form of a distillation or an extraction from this ancient text, a set of ideas that may be common to people, that's one thing. But who is going to govern that extraction? Is that going to be then submitted to the community for some kind of a democratic acceptance? I don't imagine so, because they're doing what they're doing through a legislative process. So I think that this is so complex, this is so anciently inculcated, that I don't think any kind of extraction that one group might do is going to answer for everybody. And that's what concerns me. Yeah, I mean, when I talk about doing a principle, a particular religious community might decide to look at this and say, well, how can we make sense of this in the modern world, where we live in Kenya, let's say, or where we live in Western Canada or in Southern California or whatever. That's interfacing with a biblical text in a time and place circumstance. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Not some external body saying, we're going to extract principles out of this, and that's what we're going to put up on the wall. I don't hear them saying that, but if that's what they were doing, I don't think I'd support it anymore.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Because I have often felt, Warren, that what I really want to do in all of my pastoral work is to find good ways for people to live and behave. You know, that's just kind of the basic essence of what we do as pastors. Not so much to throw texts at them, but find good ways for people to live and behave.
Especially in relationship to each other.
Exactly. That in particular. I see your point about those first four. They are extremely Semitic and extremely particular to a particular group of people. The last six are more or less universal principles. I have my questions about the 10th one, the whole covet thing. It seems to me capitalism is built on coveting. Could be wrong, but
there's probably been more debate over that one in terms of meaning and suitability than anything else, to be sure. But several of the other ones, of course, like the sixth commandment on killing. I mean, it's rare that you really have people take that apart and say, well, people are killed. The state seems to want to have a right to punish people capitally. Certainly the ancient people did that all the time. So it begins to beg the question then, well, what is this really talking about? So the translation murder makes more sense. The question about adultery, communities wide and far afield and scattered way over bodies of time and so forth have wrestled with the eighth commandment, prohibiting committing adultery. Now, committing adultery, as I was trying to suggest, is a particular kind of crime in the ancient world. But what about two teenagers who, are consider themselves having fun? Is that committing adultery? Well, there are a lot of communities will say, yes, that's a violation of the eighth commandment. Now, it may be inappropriate. It may not be the thing to do. You may want to come down on this in a number of different ways. But I don't think the eighth commandment is any way talking about that. So you start to run into this. You're going to post this on the wall, okay? But you have no idea what's behind it in many cases. And that's my main point here.
That's a good point. That's a good point, particularly the one about adultery strikes me. You have a young person in the school saying, what does it mean to commit adultery? And somebody's going to have to explain that.
I would think so if you impose upon them by putting up on the wall. Yeah.
Sooner or later, it's going to come out. Thank you. Good start to the conversation. Bjorn, take it up.
Thank you. And thank you, Warren. I'm hoping that you can hear my audio because of my shaky internet connection. But yeah, I've been noticing recently that the cultural Christianity is on the rise. I mean, politicians have obviously leveraged religion and Christianity, for a very, very long time. But celebrities, thought leaders, in my world, podcasters, really big names have either identified themselves as Christian or have been sort of Christian adjacent, like Jordan Peterson or someone like that. And some of the reasoning, especially behind the cultural Christianity, seems to be that they are alarmed that society is changing so quickly that they feel the need to reinforce Christianity, or at least the cultural forms of Christianity that they feel define Western society. They feel that Western society is a product of Christianity, essentially. So I feel, I'm not American, but I feel like this Ten Commandments business, posting it in schools is kind of that kind of an effort. That it's this kind of desperate attempt to hang on to what has been. Now, do you see that as all wrong? I mean, I understand the points you've made here, and I agree with at least most of them. But I mean, there is. Don't you think there's something to this fear of Western civilization changing very, very quickly right now? And if there's no attempt made to hold on to sort of some of the claims of Christianity or some of the cultural influences, it could be supplanted by, something very different or an entirely different religion. Like, for example, in Britain, the Islamic faith is making a lot of inroads, in terms of politics, in terms of large tides of culture, and they do not have the same qualms as Christians do about not making sort of cultural claims or insisting on cultural practices. So I guess I'm just saying, I'm not an American. I don't feel like I can make a strong statement either way. But do you understand where some of these people are coming from when they want to hang on to certain parts of Christianity, and maybe posting the Ten Commandments is part of that effort and might be therefore seen as reasonable?
Warren?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much of that came through.
I think it all came through well. Warren, I'm not seeing you. Did you hear that? Lauren, we may have lost Warren, it looks to me like. There we are, Warren. You're back. Were you able to hear Bjorn? You're muted right now, Warren.
If not, I can do an abbreviated form of the question.
Warren, I'm still not hearing you. Try your computer's microphone itself. Try that. Nope. Try your, what am I trying to say? The hardware of your computer, your microphone may have been taken off. Not coming through, Warren.
Warren, do you have Zoom on your phone? Sometimes if I have issues on my laptop, I use, like, I'm currently on my phone. That might be a workaround.
You're fancy.
Well, we can always transition from my long-winded question into something else to kill time.
Yeah, Warren, I'm still not hearing you. There must be something in your hardware with the microphone for your computer, I suspect. Let me do this. Let me ask Kevin.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Yes?
Oh, there
Yes.
we go.
Okay.
Please proceed.
You can hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes,
Something
can.
something happened to my system when the announcement came out. The meeting was being translated. I suddenly lost my camera. I lost my microphone and everything. But you can hear me now?
Yes, you are full on. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Well, I was saying that trying to plug back into the question. Yeah, I fully
Do you want
understand.
me to recap the question?
No, that's fine. I fully understand the history behind this and the contemporary concerns that some people and groups have. What I deliberately tried to stay out of legal and constitutional stuff here today, but the United States, since we're focusing on that here at the moment, was founded on certain principles that had to do with the freedom of people in a state, the right to govern themselves and so forth, and the right of them to establish institutions and people who were elected by them to carry out their wishes and so forth. In some ways, we've come a long ways away from that when we have a Supreme Court of a bunch of people that are appointed by one form of government for life and not by people in their homes voting or wherever they vote. But nevertheless, I think the framers of the American Constitution had enough sense to understand that though they themselves and maybe the majority of their people had a Judeo-Christian background, especially Christian at the time, the Puritans and all the others that founded this country. And they did so on biblical principles, on biblical language and all kinds of stuff, But they had enough sense to realize that there were others outside of that. And probably as the country would grow and develop, there would be many more from all over the place who would make this place what it is. And so I think it's, you can't help but talk about those founding documents and principles when you look at a situation today. I fully understand the constitutional thing to in my lay capacity to read texts of that nature as being problematic if you start favoring one group over another. In fact, that's really what the amendment to the Constitution says. It does, the language about separation of church and state doesn't actually appear in the text, but it is implied by all of the language that is there, that government is not going to favor one religious principle over another. Now, if a society wants to say, we don't think it's appropriate for you to kill each other in the sense of murdering each other or to steal from people. Bearing false witness is an interesting thing. It doesn't mean lying. It means standing up in court and saying the wrong thing, if you're under oath. Now, it could be extended. You shouldn't lie. Well, okay, fine. But that's not necessarily one of the Decalogue. So I think there are things there that may not make a lot of sense to us anymore. There are things that make sense to us that are not there, that we should have enough sense to then implement in ways that are supported by our framing documents, like the Constitution in this country. But there are similar things in other countries as well. So I'm concerned about the notion of civil religion. That is particularly that becomes a characteristic of American way of life very often. And the notion that this is a nation favored by God over all others. Well, that's fine. If you live in the United States, you might have that kind of viewpoint, but you may think your country has been favored by God or favored by people or whatever the case may be. Having responsibilities towards each other, this is not just an American idea. I was born in Newfoundland in Canada. I was actually born under British citizenship to begin with and became Canadian when the whole of Newfoundland became part of Canada. I came to the United States as a little kid and embraced this country and became a citizen at some point. I went back to Canada to work. I became a Canadian again. I'm a dual citizen now. So I think I have some sense of the plurality of life in the world and the plurality of the dignity of citizenship in various countries. I am troubled by what I see, politicians carrying the Bible around. They have no idea what's in it. They even publish versions of it with their name on it, have no idea what's in it. They don't live up by it. They don't live by it or anything. And it is a sham that is unfortunate. But by doing so, sometimes I think what we do is we forget that there are a lot of people around us who did not grow up this way, but are decent people who have principles, have understanding of faith and religion in their own setting and so forth. Now, one can disagree with various principles of different Christian groups or different religious groups or whatever. You can examine it intellectually or in a scholarly way and so on. But the bottom line is we believe, and as Seventh-day Adventists, we say we believe in the dignity of everybody, the right of everybody to worship God if they choose, or worship whatever God they choose in whatever way they choose, in whatever time of the day or week or whatever they choose. But sometimes implementing that is a difficult thing. Americans have this in their founding documents, but we often do not live up to that because we see ourselves as overly privileged and our documents as having some kind of trump, no pun intended, trumping other kinds of documents and being considered to be superior. That is a problem for me. And I think the wrong use of something like the Decalogue can only exacerbate the situation.
Thank you. Bjorn, does that answer your question well enough?
Thank you. Yes, that was a nuanced approach to it. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Kevin, I've appreciated your participation in the chat. I'm looking forward to your comments. What do you think?
Yeah, first I want to start out saying I really appreciated the angle that you took on this, Warren. I think it's in many ways brilliant. But you're also correct in that legislators are not going to take that into consideration when they go through it. one of the interesting things about the law, and I've got it right here, by the way, it's only 6 pages long. It's easy to read. Somebody just posted what the language is supposed to be, which is really curious that they left on the covenant side of it, thou shalt not covet, a whole bunch of lists there where they shortened everything else and completely, disregarded the fullness of the commandments on that. But what's really interesting, and maybe some of us wouldn't be aware of this, not everybody's into reading legislation. I like to do that myself because I like to find out what they're actually talking about. And when you're reading the logic and some of the legislative backing as to why they're doing what they're doing, you recognize that a guy by the name of David Barton from the Wall Builders, his fingerprints are all over it, just by the quotes and history and things that they like to bring up in their legal ideas. For example, they quoted a quote from James Madison that says, "We have staked our whole future on our new nation to pattern ourselves according to the moral principles of the Ten Commandments." They quote a quote that doesn't even exist by Madison. So right off the bat, they're making this legislative decision, and that quote doesn't even exist that anybody's been able to find. And they make another drastic mistake in the Mayflower Compact. They like to show that one as well, saying that it was the first written constitution. That is not correct. It wasn't even a constitution. But the point of it is, you see this flow, and it's going back to what Warren was saying about, a group of individuals who are trying to claw back to the 1950s America that they once knew, that was predominantly Protestant Christianity. What I find more troubling about this whole thing is that in order to move this through, they've had to lower the Ten Commandments from a divine realm to just a historical document. It's a historical document among other historical documents. In fact, they went on and they quoted the case out of 2005 and the Texas case on the Ten Commandments as supporting their basis, but they totally ignored the same year and another SCOTUS decision on a Ten Commandments display in courthouses in Kentucky, which was voted down, which would apply to what they're trying to do. And that's what I find quite interesting. But to me, that's the troubling aspect of it, is the very fact that they've reduced what we'd find as sacred. I mean, after all, it was God's finger who wrote it in stone. That we reduce it down to just just common documents, found in some aspects of American writings and things like that. And that's probably the most disturbing part of it, of the whole thing. And it's often the aspect that's overlooked. But anyway, I just wanted to make those comments, a few of those comments, and also just to thank you, Warren, I really appreciated the angle that you took on analyzing. I think it's at least good for us to think about.
Can you hear me now? No?
Yeah.
Okay. You can.
You are on, Warren. Go ahead.
Getting all kinds of messages.
I got one phrase, getting all kinds of messages, and then you're muted again. What's happening? I think it's a terrorist attack. Lauren, call off the guard. Warren, whatever you did last time, try it again. Check your settings for your microphone. I have a hunch.
It says I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Now you are on. Please proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, for some reason, I'm getting this meeting is recorded and this meeting is disconnected and it's getting messed up. But anyway, I appreciate Kevin's legal brief on this. I will just call it that. That's very interesting. Let me just say that I heard this from the Louisiana, on the internet from the Louisiana Action, and I immediately sat down and I wrote something kind of similar to what's going to be published or is being published in A Today. I didn't go into all of the details that I did. So I normally would look at legislation myself on something like that because I'm very interested in that kind of stuff too. But this was a top of mind reaction. I don't change my mind on it hearing about what you've brought, Kevin, but that's very insightful in helping to understand what's happening there. So just that little caveat. I don't have really anything to say except that, it's the motivation behind it, I think, is one thing. The method is flawed, and it tends to be internally contradictory as to, you establish a nation on these principles, but you almost then assume, unless you're going to go on and say people have freedom to think and do as they wish, I mean, do in the sense of religion. Otherwise you're kind of assuming that America was established as the great beacon of Christianity, and everyone who comes here must become Christian. So it becomes an evangelistic sort of thing. That would be untenable. But anyway, my main point, Kevin, is I appreciate the background you've provided. That was excellent.
Good. I'm trying to get people to come on, and I seem to have lost my right. There you go, James Stovall. You are up. I appreciate it. What did you got to say? Now I'm not hearing you. Oh no. You're officially unmuted on my screen, but you are not coming through. Check your settings. Wow. Still not hearing you. It says you are unmuted on my screen. Let's try this. Look at that for a second. George, can you unmute and see if you can come on verbally? Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, you are on.
Okay, very good. Warren, thank you so much for this presentation. I always appreciate your presentations, and particularly this one on a subject that's very current and complicated. It seems to me that there is a group, of course it doesn't seem, it is, there is a group pushing something regarding to the Christian faith. Apparently, they have tried a few times, and this is another instance of that. The facade looks good. It's like just putting something there, 10 commandments, that you drive human behavior and all that. However, I am very suspicious of this because this group must have a bigger agenda than just putting, posting the 10 commandments here and there or everywhere. It seems to me that the agenda may be really dangerous to other religions. What I mean is, I'm wondering if this group of Christians is actually trying to make a division between Christian religion and other religions, and eventually disregard and deny rights to other religions. At the end of the day, we are in times, very difficult times in America regarding to human rights and religious rights. We'll be probably involved in that. And the next election is crucial to this, could be a disaster to this country if it goes in a certain direction. Our freedom it may be compromised right there. And unfortunately, many Christians, including Adventists, are supporting changes like that. So back to the 10 Commandments there, what do you think about my suspicion that the agenda could be actually much bigger than just, oh, posting a few commandments in a school? Thank you.
My screen was going on and off here, maybe like some of the rest of you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you are
Yes.
loud and clear.
Oh, okay, because I'm getting different messages here. George, yes, I do agree. I think there's probably much bigger agenda here. And I don't want to get particularly political, you know, in a specific kind of sense here. But just the notion that evangelical Christianity in particular has been, I think, politically weaponized towards this country. And I don't think it's, you know, it seems incomprehensible to me because in many respects, the practitioners thereof are not in any way behaving like evangelical Christians typically expect. So I think there is probably a larger agenda, and
I just lost you again, Warren.
yeah, I'm
Now we're good. You're good again. Go ahead.
You know, Warren, I think what might be happening is you're having a little bit of an interruption in your
Bandwidth issue?
bandwidth, and I think that mutes you, and then you have to come back again. But it looks like something that I've been doing, Gerald, is I mute him and then ask him to unmute, and
Okay.
that seems to bring him back again.
Try it again. And perhaps if that doesn't work, ask him to stop the video.
There you go. Okay, Warren.
yeah,
There you are. See?
yes.
Go ahead. No,
No.
lost it again.
Now, so now I'm okay, right?
Now you're good. Okay. Lost it again.
Of Zoom as well, and so
Now you're on.
Yeah, this is a new version of Zoom, and a lot of this is looking different to me. I spent hundreds of hours on Zoom teaching and otherwise during the pandemic. I've never had this, but Zoom, I think, has gone through some change, and that may be part of it. I'm working on a new computer as well. That may be part of it. But George, I'll just get back to you and say I agree. I think there's a bigger agenda here. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but I think you're correct.
If I may just add one thing, it seems to me that it's not actually a Christian agenda, as I said. Yeah, it's an evangelical, but the evangelicals are refusing to adhere to certain Christian principles. They are just, for me, they are apostatized Christians. They were Christians in the past, maybe, but not now, because they are not supporting and defending Christians' beliefs. They are just tolerating and encouraging other beliefs and moral principles that are contrary, opposite to the Christian proposals. So I think we are in a bigger danger here than we actually are aware of. Thank you for your presentation, your comments again.
Thank you, George, and for expanding our concept there. James, let's try it again.
All right. Are we okay
You're
now?
on. Excellent. Beautiful.
Well, a couple of things that bothers me about this whole Ten Commandments bit, or any derivative of it, it's still meant to be exclusionary. What about the atheist, the agnostic, and all the other religious beliefs? Those are hanging on the wall. Are you including those? No matter how generic you make it, it is basically exclusive. It's for a certain group of people. So how can you have something like that? I don't understand it, other than the fact that somebody wants to control others, which seems to be, in my view, the general rule for having those. It allows them to rail against all kinds of things which they have been doing. And I can see SDAs going along with it because essentially, for at least in my world, being raised as an SDA, we were taught that only good comes from God. There's no inherent goodness in any human being. So therefore, it stands to reason, well, without those rules up there, nobody will know how to be good. And to the atheist says, wait a minute, I'm living my life. I'm looking after my neighbor. I'm doing all these things. I just don't happen to believe that it comes from a God. So we're excluding them one way or another. You look at the 12 disciples, they were from all segments of the lower edges of society. To me, that says this Christ person was all inclusive. He wasn't exclusive at all. So if you got these rules up there and say, well, it really just means what we all know you should be doing, I don't buy it.
Good. Appreciate your cynicism there, Warren. What do you think?
Well, let me say back to George for just a moment. I think it's interesting to me how to figure out evangelicals in the political scene today. They are supporting people that don't support the principles, don't live the principles that they espouse, which is very interesting. But one of the things that emerges in my thinking is the most important thing, I think, on the political landscape for evangelicals, and I may be totally wrong with this, but this is my view. The most important thing is controlling or eliminating abortion. And so with that in mind, then, the way that you can achieve that in the United States presently in the political scenery is to populate the Supreme Court with people that will rule that way. And so the most important thing to do is to get people elected to offices that are involved in the nomination of, and eventually will vote to confirm the federal judges, including Supreme Court judges. And if that is your motivation, if that is your bottom line, which I think it is, when I think about the whole situation, it doesn't make any difference about the behaviors and the various kinds of non-conformity of people to the principles of evangelical Christianity, which I think we probably all would, in general, espouse. But if you have a political agenda that says we must get rid of abortion, let's put in a position those people that can make that happen, regardless of how they behave personally. That's the only thing that makes sense to me on the political scene right now. Now, I didn't really come here today to pontificate on this, but yeah, I mean, James, you have I think brought up something that's interesting, and I would say that if we were to put something on the wall, maybe the words of Jesus of Nazareth as a guideline, rather than, let's say, as a simple rule, another rule on which to behave or whatever. Jesus said basically that the whole law hung on two principles: love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you don't believe in the Lord your God, fine. At least you can believe in loving your neighbor as yourself. And that is a basic principle, I think, that could motivate people or could challenge people to live better lives in this world. You might have to have some other way of dealing with the other parts of the Decalogue, but that is a universal principle. That is a distillation of a part of the Decalogue that is part of the tradition then of reflection of Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know. I'm more concerned right now in this piece with trying to show that what we have taken for granted as a universal document that originally started in Judaism and has passed through Christianity, that document continues to be dated. It continues to be oriented to a particular group in a time and place which is different from ours. And I think we simply just need to know that.
Good point. Both of you are bringing out some very important things. Eduardo, you've been here for a while. What's on your mind and how did you respond?
Thank you. Warren, when the idea of separation of church and state in Germany, France, and Portugal, popes wrote encyclicals about it, in which the language is terrible. It attempts to extinguish the existence of Rome. I wish you can have those encyclicals to see the terrible language that they use to degrade the separation of church and state. I have an experience of listening to the Supreme Court through the internet. And I noticed that when the defenders of separation of church and state make their best arguments, the Supreme Court justices, they ask them, oh, you want us to take the word creator out of the Constitution? Do you want it to take us in God we trust out of the money in the Congress? Oh, no. We don't want that. So nobody wants to do it, so they don't have a case. Nobody wants to attempt to take the word creator and God we trust. So every effort is just useless if they don't want to separate the church and state. What do you think?
Well, I mean, when you use an expression like "in God we trust," you can include. It can be a very broadly inclusive statement for a population, because Jewish people, Islamic people, Hindus, and Buddhists, and so forth, could rally around the validity of a broad sort of theistic kind of statement. The problem comes when you try to include within that circle then the people who don't believe in God at all, the people whose faith tradition essentially is non-faith. And as I read I'm now bridging back into the Constitution again instead of the Scripture. If you look at the founding documents of this country and some other places, of course, popes are going to be concerned with that because their historic power has been granted by secular governments, and in turn, they exercise the power to, in some cases, appoint, as they have over the centuries, political leaders in these countries. So there's a symbiotic relationship. But that's not what is intended, I see, in the American Constitution. Sure, those people were Christians who founded this nation. They believed in God. They put money out, I suppose, with that language on it, and so forth. But and of course, people that don't believe in God, they don't mind using the money with that on it. And maybe for practical purposes, they don't have any concern about changing it. But they don't identify with the language on there, nor should they have to. So, that goes beyond the particular meaning of the Ten Commandments I was trying to look at. But that's my viewpoint on the matter. that if you believe, one of the problems is that maybe it's a good thing that the expression separation of church and state does not appear in the founding documents. What really we're talking about here, if we understand that what they were trying to achieve, is that it is not the separation of church and state. It's the separation of conscience relating to faith and belief and Christian practice, not Christian, but religious practice of some sort, of any sort, or non-practice as the case may be. In other words, the church, the state should not be involved in the religious consciences of people. So when you mention church, you're already, presuming that this is a relationship between the state and Christianity, which it is not. It is a stated relationship between between the state and its citizens with regard to their faith. And
Good.
that is, I think, we need to get back to that. Otherwise, we are already then assuming the priority of Christianity.
I think that's well stated, Warren, and I think we all do well to hear it. Ed Reifsnyder.
Good afternoon. I want to pick up where George Tishy left off about motivations and agenda. It's interesting that someone has raised the question of whether these kinds of moves are things Adventists since the 1800s have believed would happen in the last days. And I would not pile on to that concept, but I would say that we may be seeing events that are occurring from motives that are different than we would have historically thought. This may not be driven by a spiritual agenda so much as a political agenda, one in which there is fear. I want to talk about several points that are causing fear among some folks in our country. Number one is loss of control and privilege. The more our population is composed of different segments, and the more some segments shrink and some grow, that generates fear among those who have historically had the privileged position. There are growing minority groups in our country, many of whom are not Christian. This takes away from the controlling block, so to speak, historically that we've had, and waters down the influence of Christianity, maybe ever so slowly, but nonetheless. Then we have declining churches. Church membership is down, church attendance is down. We have growing numbers of nuns and agnostics. All these people are outside the reach of the church. Then we have, as part of all these things that I've already mentioned, we have declining white Christian control. And let's face it, that's a reality. I don't know if I'd call it racism, but it's a loss of control in the white community, particularly the white Christian community. Why, my goodness, we even have Muslims in Congress. Then there's the whole idea of the replacement theory, in which people of other races and other skin colors and other belief systems are going to replace all the whites that have been in control. So all these things, I think, cause fear among certain groups of people. And they want to make moves that would try to preserve the past or the status quo of the past. This could be one of those, because it might be an attempt to try to influence children to move in the direction of Christianity by putting a poster in front of them, which may be a little bit like Jacob putting the striped sticks in front of the sheep. In any event, I think that a large part of what we're seeing is driven by fear rather than spiritual ambition. Any validity to that from your perspective, Warren?
Absolutely. I think that's the case. And I would expand it, I think, a little bit, Ed, into contemporary Adventism. I think I could go down and say about the same thing going on in our faith community. It's, the last couple of general conference sessions have dealt with some very interesting issues on the world stage of Adventism. And knowing the direction of these demographic phenomena that you just reviewed, broadly speaking, we find the same things happening within our faith community, to the point where I was able to predict the outcome of these votes on several contentious issues to within 1 or 2% based on the emerging demographics. So I see the same thing going on. And I think fear and all of the different categories that you attached fear to, we experience as well. And so, yes, I think this country is going through some things, and you can say, well, we've got to shut the doors of the border. That's going to do it. I mean, it comes out in all different kinds of ways. What are the types of people coming in? Forgetting, of course, that in one form or another, we are all immigrants or the descendants of them, and that this has been the characteristic of a place like this. And this is not the only part of the world. It's happens in a number of places. You can see some of the same things going on in Europe, I think. But and some of the same political reactions taking place in Europe for probably the same reasons. So yeah, I appreciate what you said. I agree with that.
Right. Thank you for both of you elucidating that underlying tenet. Doug Myers.
Yes, thank you, Warren, for your presentation. I think it was very good. And just to clarify, although I'm vacationing in Canada, I am very much American. I'm going to take a little bit different tack. I'm also just a layman, but my understanding is that our founders were deists and not what we would classically think, or I would classically think of as Christian in the current context. Whether or not that's true, I'm not an expert in that. But my reaction to what Louisiana legislatures are imposing, I guess, is the result of my being on the receiving end of rulemaking and legislation, and it's tactical rather than strategic. And so my approach is to say, okay, you want me to paste that on the wall? 11 by 17, I think, is the minimum size. I'll say next to that, the Code of Hammurabi, the various versions that you articulated. I'll paper the walls with all of those versions and start off by telling the kids, although I'm stretching this a little bit in my thinking, working with kindergartners, I'm not quite sure how they would receive this, but sort of start the history lesson by saying, and by the way, here's what your legislators are currently thinking. That's their version. And here's the version that's in the Douay version for Catholics. And here's the version that maybe the Babylonians had. And here's the version that somebody else had. And I guess my idea is to make it as transparently universal and simply put it in its context, which I think would restore it to its appropriate level of consideration. Because I don't believe, and I could be wrong, I haven't looked it up, I'm not sure that Louisiana said you can't post anything else. So as long as they said you couldn't post anything else, I'm going to say, if I were a classroom teacher, I'd say I'm going to post that along with the 438 other versions of things and just make it in its historic context. Horace, excellent presenter here, has had, I know, a career doing biblical history in a public college rather than elementary or primary school. But I think to me that would help establish, if I had to comply, establish what they have imposed in its correct place. Anyway, just for something else to think about.
Well, those are some good ideas. What might be, I haven't really thought much about this. I mean, I'm a retired educator, and so I should look at the pedagogical aspect of all this at some point, I guess. But I would say that if we have an opportunity, if we, others have an opportunity to stimulate a conversation with another person, including children, as to what our responsibilities and privileges are with regard to living in community, let's say. What helps to make living in community successful? It's kind of interesting that a lot of these translations focus on the idea of neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's property, neighbor this. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. The Hebrew words used there can also be translated as friend, your friends. So one of the things that maybe we could do, instead of posting rules, whether they be singular ones or hundreds of them, is to talk about what are our responsibilities towards each other and how can we do a better job at enunciating them and then living them. Do we understand them? Do we understand why we have these kinds of obligations and privileges? And then obviously, how does faith work? Does it work for you? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it does work for you, well, what are the kinds of ingredients that maybe that might entail? And does one, in fact, influence the other? That is, some kind of a faith experience. Does that inform your life in community with other people? I think these would be exciting things to talk about. And I believe children, in their own way, could engage very productively in that kind of thing. I think Jesus of Nazareth knew what he was saying when he said, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. I think one of the things, we just make it too complicated sometimes. And we need to engage people, even children, say, what is our responsibility in this classroom to the person in front of you and to the back of you and right and left and so on? And how can we improve that? And how can we make this whole thing a better and more meaningful kind of experience? That would be exciting to engage in, I think, with children.
Yeah, I like where you've taken this, and from your opening that window, I'm brought back to a time when a very similar question was asked of Jesus himself, who said, you've asked, who is your neighbor? And told the story that lives for all of us.
Yeah.
about a person who was robbed and left for dead, and a good Samaritan lived the law. I think that's a powerful quotation and a powerful story.
In our world, that would be kind of like saying you got mugged in San Diego.
Yeah. Left
And
with
along
nothing.
comes a person out of Mexico.
Yeah.
And heals you, puts salve on you, puts you up in an inn so that you can recover, and
Right.
comes back to make sure you're okay and so forth, you know.
Right. Covers the bill, all those things. You're right. I think that's profound. Carolyn James, you momentarily put your hand up, and I hope that was because you had a thought. If you do, please unmute. I'd love to hear what you have to think about this. While we're thinking about that, Lauren, share with us a bit about what's coming up in the next week or two or three. I think you've got some interesting things on cue.
Oh, I do. And I'm very excited about it. Next week, you will really enjoy this. I invited Michael Schofield back because he has, I've told you before, I like to have a little kind of a change of different people doing different things. Next week is going to be history with a little bit of theology. Michael Schofield has done some work where he studies old periodicals from the early part of the church. And this is interesting. He has identified 8 strong anxieties that the early Seventh-day Adventists have, and he's going to talk to us about those 8 anxieties. What were the things that really worried people? And some of them are really interesting, things we wouldn't think of today. Am I going to be among those who are translated? It was a big one. Do I get to be translated? And so some of these should be fascinating. Michael is a very thorough researcher, and he'll bring you all of these ideas and bring them all together. This should be fun. I think you'll really like it. It will give us an insight into the foundation of our church that I don't think we very often have. You know, I have said this before, and I'll say it again. When we talk about historic Adventism, we very often end up talking about the historic Adventism that our church leaders want us to think of as historic Adventism, because we are, above all else, we are apologists. We constantly are doing apologetics whenever we talk about our church and its history. I don't know if you remember, Warren, Stephen Mervyn's Maxwell's famous book on church history, Tell It to the World. And it was so clearly a myth making of sort of what the church was like in its early form. And so this is fun. I love what Michael's going to do. He's going to dig in underneath what the stories are that we tell about our early church. And instead, he's going to look at what people were actually talking about when they wrote letters to the editor in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. So that should be really, really interesting. I'm looking forward to it. Let me see. Do you want me to have a prayer at this point, Gerald?
Well, you spoke about next week. Who's coming after that? And then, yes.
Oh, yes. Coming after that is one of our favorite teachers. Everybody really enjoys it when Reinder Brinsma comes. He's going to be talking on the second week in August. And his topic is something that probably too many of us on this call are interested in right now. And that is the spiritual implications of growing old. And yeah, I mean, look
That's
at
relevant. You're right.
Here, look, look at all this white hair. I often say when I do a funeral, I say, when we were 40 years ago, when we knew each other, and a lot of us did know each other at that time, who ever thought about death? Who ever thought about growing old? None of us. It's so far off, we don't even have to give it a thought. And Reiner is one of those people who takes seriously and has the courage to stand up and talk about it. So that's going to be one of his topic on the 3rd. After that, I've got Charles Scriven. Some of you know Chuck,
You bet.
a longtime friend of mine. He and his whole family, I've known them since we were quite young. And he hasn't given me a topic yet. So that's about as far out as I can reach, Gerald, without having
Okay.
to dig in and find out
No,
what
that's
they've
good.
actually told me.
That'll prompt our appetites and keep us attuned. Yes, if you're so inclined, could you have a prayer for us, and we can see if there's a few more thoughts afterwards.
I shall indeed. Kind Heavenly Father, we're deeply grateful for teachers who are able to stimulate our thoughts and take us into new regions of understanding. We pray that there'll be more to our faith and thoughts, that you will also help those who are struggling in one way or another this week to have the peace of Christ that passes all understanding. And I pray that you will bless each one as we go through the coming week. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay, are there any
Carolyn
more?
had raised her hand momentarily. I'm not sure. Carolyn, do you have anything you would
Carolyn
be willing
Jarnes.
to share?
Yes, I see you, Carolyn. Let me ask you to unmute.
Yeah. And Warren, it had occurred to me, what do you think of this effort as a direct counteraction for anticipated enshrinement of Sharia law? If someone came in and took over our government, would this be a way to have immunized our children against Sharia law? Is that going too far?
Well, it is interesting. I think that, of course, talking about this phenomenon passed my mind several times here today. I have lived from time to time in the Middle East, done archaeology in Jordan, and I have some sense of how some of these societies operate. And what comes to my mind right now is that if you were to raise this question with most people in this country, they would be horrified at the prospect of Islamic law becoming enshrined as the the expected norm and the norm of behavior and what have you in this country. But you could pull out any kind of set of principles from Confucius or whatever, and everybody here would tend to react the same kind of way. They would be horrified at that kind of direction. But the very notion that you would pull out part of the tradition that we all have been comfortable with, or we've grown up with, or whatever, and you try to enshrine that as the norm, there is no difference at all.
Yeah.
There's no difference, principally speaking, in all of that. And that's what we seem to be forgetting. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine politicians who, decided that they were going to not allow any people from certain countries to come into this country, or in the future might expel them from this country?
Wow.
Well,
Yeah.
what if the tables were turned on that? People would be horrified with it. But we're dealing with a set of phenomena that are really coming out of the same cut of the fabric, and that's what we need to be thinking about, I think.
Good. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Carolyn, we're trying. I would love to hear what you have to say. Can you try again? I think Lauren and I are both trying to get that through. Can you raise your hand, Carolyn? Try that again.
Yeah, Ward,
Let's try that here. Got your hand up. I see you. I'm not hearing you. It's not allowing. Lauren, do you see that? Now we're good. Nope, nope, nope. Try again.
well, Carolyn, if you just tell me if you just write me a little note here. Sometimes that happens, and so people just can't unmute. Sometimes happens when you're on a phone or whatever. But if anybody else wants to join the conversation, please do.
Add in a little bit. We'll help out.
Yeah, I would just raise this point, Warren. I think I think a lot of us are fairly alarmed by the desire in all parts of the United States government. Now, I know you mentioned that authoritarianism is happening in a lot of places, and it is. Hungary comes to mind. Hungary was at one point very much a democratic country after it left the communist orbit. It is not as democratic anymore. They've managed to use democratic processes to lock up a lot of things. It reminds me of Benjamin Franklin's line. He said, "We're making America a republic if you can keep it." And I'm struggling right now to know why people who have some understanding of the history of our nation would not want to keep it. They're very frightened of they're very frightened of things just falling apart, and they feel like the more authoritarianism they can bring in, the better they're going to be able to control things. And this, I think I got a piece from one of my friends overseas where she said, "I look across the ocean and I'm frightened." And frankly, I live here and I'm frightened. And so I don't really know what to do about that other than to make the observation, Warren, that I think a lot of us are at this point wondering what's going to happen next. There seems to be a real desire to make us into a somehow Christian nation. I quoted an article that I just read recently, a professor at Masters University who said, and this is a Christian college, by the way, and he said, there is not one reference among any of the founding fathers saying that they wanted to make America a Christian nation. He says they weren't even as deists. They were secular moralists, is I think how he put it. They believed that there should be a religion, but any religion would do, is how he said it. He said any religion will qualify here. All religions should be respected, but they were secular moralists. The idea, he didn't even, he said, I don't think they were actually, he actually denied the idea that they were deists. He said, he used this other phrase. I'm frightened. I suspect a lot of people are frightened.
Yeah, I see hands raised all around.
Oh,
Robert
good.
Ramsey, you've been distilling thoughts for the last 2 hours. Tell me what's come up.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, you are loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. I grew up in Canada, still live in Canada. All through primary school, high school, we had Bible reading. This was public school. We had Bible reading and the Lord's Prayer every morning. And I'm wondering, if we post the 10 Commandments, are the teachers going to have to comment on them, or is it just a matter of putting them on the wall? I think of our maps of the world and Canada. We had a little picture in the corners of the Cadbury chocolate bar. Now, that didn't influence me to buy Cadbury chocolate bars. The teacher never commented on it. It had no influence on me at all, except probably make me hungry. So I'm just wondering, is there any obligation for a teacher in the public school to comment on the Ten Commandments, or do they just sit on the wall?
Warren, what's your assessment of that? And if anybody else knows, let's hear about it.
I would defer to, I'm looking around the screen here, the person who was talking about the legislation itself.
That would be Kevin James. I think
Kevin, yes. He's not on my screen right now, but maybe he's not even here.
Yeah, he had
but I don't know the answer to that. I'm assuming that, like a lot of these things, legislation is designed to placate the conscience of the legislator. They do something like that and they feel, well, we've done something important. We put the Ten Commandments up. But is that going to make any difference? The likelihood is that probably it wouldn't without what you're talking about, which would be the discussion about it. I would love to have discussion with students about that, but I wouldn't start with the Ten Commandments. I would start with community and some general kinds of things like we were talking before. But no, I doubt that there is any kind of discussion. You remember that legislation there was from K through university, from kindergarten through the classrooms of state universities, like Louisiana State University, presumably, LSU. So how do you do that? I mean, in Canada, I know there's a different kind of tradition. I grew up with that. I lived with it for a long time. The Canadian Constitution, which was retrieved from the British some years ago, has built into it a religious education system. And it's practiced in Canada today. I mean, the public school system is a derivative, as I understand it, from the Protestant side of things. And that functions in Quebec and maybe a couple of other places as the Catholic system. So you have the public and the separate system. All of that is provided for in the Canadian Constitution. This is a different sort of model than in the United States. But I think in terms of the basic separation principles of faith and state apply. But you're quite right. I remember living in Alberta, and there were religion classes going on in the public schools, and the Ministerial Association had responsibility for going in and teaching one or more of those classes throughout the year and so forth. So it's a different kind of model, to be sure. But, the friends that I have there still who are in the legal community are equally committed, I think, to behaviors, state behaviors, government behaviors there that they would feel would be appropriate in the United States as well. So, yeah. But it's a different world.
So can I answer the question? So there are a couple of different laws that are on the table, right, or have been passed.
Hold for just a second. Make sure that everybody knows that we're listening to Dr. Ray speak, okay?
Okay.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a law that was passed by Louisiana's governor on June 19th that required all the classrooms to display the Ten Commandments. And there was another law that was passed in Oklahoma on June 27th that stated, effective immediately, Oklahoma schools are required to incorporate the Bible, which includes the Ten Commandments, in grades 5 through 12 into their curriculum. So, and then there are other states, there's Texas, South Carolina, and Utah that have different versions of incorporation of the Ten Commandments and religious instructions into their curriculum. So it's different things in different states. So apparently for the Louisiana, it seems the text of the Louisiana law, it just requires it to be displayed. But for Oklahoma, Texas, or for the one that's passed in Oklahoma and the one that's on the table for Texas, South Carolina, and Utah, those are actually asking that the Bible be taught in those grades. So just to make that distinction clear.
That's
and
good.
And also just to say, I know that people were saying, well, how about having teachers put up like all these other laws and things like that? too. I mean, I guess that's great if teachers can afford it, but I don't know how many of you have been teachers on this call. And one of the things that the law had stated is that they're not even going to pay or supply the ones that they're asking them to put up for the 10 Commandments, those posters. So teachers have to come out of pocket, or the schools have to figure out how to get those up. And so for a teacher to do this resistance of diluting it by putting up a lot of other laws, that means that they're going to have to probably pay to get those made too. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not just as cut and dried as they're just able to resist in those ways. It would be nice if they had the budget to, but that's not always the case for everyone. So.
Agreed. Good point. Thank you for pointing that out to us. That'll be most interesting to watch. Warren, any final thoughts or comments?
Well, I'm tempted to say something about my background here, lest you think that I've posted the 10 Commandments or something like it. This is just for your information. I have a bunch of virtual backgrounds that I use. This one, I don't know why I chose this today, but this is a copy of papyrus number 46. We call it P46. It's a 3rd century New Testament manuscript, one of the earliest texts we have of the letters of Paul. And the top couple of lines, actually the very top line, I think, constitutes the last piece of the book of Romans. And underneath that is a title, which it says to the Hebrews. So it's the beginning of the letter to the Hebrews. Whoever put this together assumed that Paul had written Hebrews, I guess, and they listed it in this manuscript as coming directly after Romans.
Right.
So anyway, I put it up here because I like the papyrus and the old Greek form that is listed here. I'm not in any way posting it for purposes like the 10 Commandments. So just that caveat.
Thank you for that explanation, but several of us did enjoy that background. Thank you so much for telling us about it. Folks, I have appreciated this afternoon immensely. I appreciate you all. I love you all.